Her debt was measured in pounds of her own flesh. A Lakota chief paid it in beaver pelts and wed her. My name is Hokaluta, Red Hawk, if you need it in your language. I am Oglala Lakota, chief of a band of 63 people who range the high plains north of the Breaks, and I have been a chief for 19 years, since my father's death in the winter of '51. I do not tell you this to establish my importance. I tell you because what I did, what I am about to tell you, was not the act of an ordinary man, and the things that led to it were not ordinary either, and if you are going to understand it, you need to know who was doing it. I tell you other things first, briefly. My father was a man of such steadiness that people confused it for coldness and were surprised later to learn they were wrong. He taught me, a man who speaks carefully is not a man with nothing to say. He is a man who understands the weight of words. I have tried to be that. My mother was a woman who could track a deer through hard frost and also read a man's intentions from 60 yards, which she said were not such different skills. She lived to 71 and her mind was clear to the end, and she died on a morning when the geese were going south, which she said was the right time. I still talk to her sometimes in my head. She does not always answer, but when she does, she is right. I had a wife for 29 years, Taniedu, Autumn Woman. I have said she died of fever. What I have not said and will say now, so you understand the full picture, is that the 2 years after she died were the worst of my life, and I have had years with bad things in them. She and I had become, over 29 years, so tangled in each other's workings that without her I did not always know what I thought about things until I had said them to someone, and there was no one to say them to the way I could say them to her. My sister helped. My sons helped. I did not fall. But I moved through those 2 years like a man navigating a house he knows well in the dark, touching the walls, careful. I was not looking for another wife. That is the honest thing to say. I was not looking. I was 51 years old and I knew my capabilities and my limits, and I had made a kind of peace with the shape my life had taken. My sister ran the lodge. I ran the band. It was enough, or near enough. I slept. That was the life I was living. The morning Tall Feather told me about the woman in the river town. The pelts were still damp when I stacked them on Harker's counter. 11 of them, prime winter beaver, each one rolled and tied with sinew the way my father's father taught, the way you do when you want a man to understand the seriousness of what you're offering. Harker ran his thumb along the first one. He always did that, feeling for thin spots for summer fur that a man had tried to pass for winter, and I watched his face, which told me nothing and everything. He was a small man who believed he was large. The trading post smelled of coal oil and rancid lard, and the particular kind of fear that comes off a man who owes more than he earns. I had been inside that smell many times over 20 years of trade. I had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of the river. 14, I said. He looked up. Behind him, through the open door to the back room, I could hear her moving, a scrape of something across the floor, then stillness. 12's fair, he said. There's a glut. There was no glut. He was lying about the glut the way men like Harker lie about everything, reflexively, for the practice of it, the way some men cough. 14, I said again, and set my hands flat on the counter. He looked at my hands. Men often did. I have my mother's hands wide across the knuckles, the kind of hands that suggest things without meaning to. He looked at them, then at the pelts, then at me, and he decided. 14, he said, but I need the debt receipt signed over. I said I knew that. He said she'd have to agree to it. I said I knew that too. He went through the door. I listened to his voice and hers. Hers was quieter. I could not hear the words, only the shape of what was being said, his voice going up the way a man's does when he's explaining terms, and hers low and even, asking something. Then a pause. Then her voice again, a single word, low and clear as a stone dropped in still water. He came back and picked up a pen and handed it to me, and I signed where he pointed, And that was how I bought the debt of Clara Marsh from a man who had never been owed anything that wasn't stolen first. I should say what the debt was. Not because it matters to what came after, but because people heard different things, and most of what they heard was wrong. Her husband, she was a widow when I met her, had been one for 6 weeks. Her husband, Ned Marsh, had borrowed against the store's credit. He was a man who believed the land owed him something, the way certain men do, men who come west with a picture in their head and then spend the rest of their lives furious at the actual country for not resembling it. He had borrowed for seed, for a plow, for 2 mules, for lumber. He had borrowed for a rifle he traded away. He had borrowed for whiskey he did not trade away. He had borrowed $42 over 14 months, and then in March he had ridden out to check on a section of fence line, and the horse had stepped in a hole, and Ned Marsh had not come back. Clara had paid $8 of it herself in 3 installments by taking in mending at 3 cents a shirt. Do you know how many shirts 3 cents a shirt is to get to $8? I have thought about this since. It is a great many shirts. The $34 remaining Harker had decided to collect in a way that was not uncommon on the frontier, and which I will not describe here in detail, except to say that it involved the word arrangement, and that there were 2 other men in town who used that word when they talked about Clara Marsh, and that she had taken to locking her door with a chair wedged under the handle and not going out after dark. I had heard about her from Tall Feather, who heard it from a Mateys trapper named Beaumont, who had seen her at the well one morning and noticed the way she held herself, the particular stillness of a person who has learned to make herself smaller. Tall Feather had said, "This white woman has no one." I had thought about it for 3 days, which is not a long time, but is longer than I usually think about strangers. I went to the trading post on a Tuesday. I came back on Thursday with the Pelts. She was sitting on a crate in the back room when Harker brought me through, and she stood up when I came in, and we looked at each other for a moment in the way 2 people do when they are deciding what the other one is. She was perhaps 30, pale. There was a bruise along the left side of her jaw that was 3 or 4 days old, gone yellow-green at the edges. Her hair was brown, and she wore it pinned back with what looked like a nail, a finishing nail, which I noted. Her hands were rough in the way that mending work makes them rough, the webbing between the fingers chapped and split. She wore a dress the color of creek mud that had been mended so many times the original seams were buried under new ones. She was not what a man would call small. She had good shoulders and she stood with them level, which told me something. She said, "Mr. Hokaluda," I said. "Red Hawk if you prefer it in English." She said Red Hawk quietly, testing the sound of it. She said, "I understand what he sold you." I said, "The receipt of debt, yes." She said, "I want to be plain about what I will and won't do." I looked at her. I said, "Good, be plain." She looked at me steadily and she said, "I won't be kept." I told her I hadn't offered to keep her. She said, "Men who pay debts for women generally have a purpose." I said, "I have a purpose. I'll tell you what it is. You don't have to agree." She was quiet for a moment. Harker was still in the doorway and she looked at him and her look was enough. He went back through the door and pulled it partway closed behind him. She turned back to me and she said, "Tell me." I told her. I said that I was a chief of the Oglala band, that my wife had died 2 winters ago of fever, that my sons were grown, that my lodge was run by my sister who had her own family and did not wish to run it forever. I said that I needed a woman of practical disposition who could manage a household and who would be treated with respect inside the band. I said that I was not a young man and did not pretend to be. I said that there was a distinction, which I wanted her to understand, between a kept woman and a wife, that a wife was a partner in the work of a household, that she would have standing, that there were things in the band that were hers to decide, and that I would not overrule her on them. I said I understood she had no reason to trust me. I said she didn't have to make any decision today. She listened to all of this without moving her face. When I finished, she said, "Why me?" I said I had heard she was a hard worker who was in a difficult position. She said, there are women in difficult positions everywhere. I said, yes. She thought for a moment. She said, would I be free to leave if I found I couldn't? I said, yes. Though I'd hope you'd say so directly and not just go. She said, what if I said so and you wouldn't let me? I said, then you'd have been right not to trust me, but I don't keep people. She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her thinking, and I let her think, because that is the correct thing to do and because there was nothing more to say. She said, I'll need a week. I have some things here. I said I'd come back in a week. I went back through the trading post and out into the sun, and Harker was behind his counter and he said, she probably won't do it. I said, then she won't. I went out and got on my horse and rode north and didn't look back. She was ready when I came back. She had one bag and a tin box. The bag was a flour sack that had been hemmed and fitted with rope handles. The tin box was small, the kind you keep keepsakes in, with a dent in one corner. She was standing in front of the post when I rode up, and she had a hat on, a man's hat, too large for her, and she'd folded cloth inside the band to make it fit, and she looked at my horse and she said, I don't ride well. I said that was fine and helped her up behind me. She held my belt, not my coat, not my shirt, my belt, the leather one with the brass ring, and she held it with 2 fingers precisely, like a woman who has thought about how to do this without presuming. I noticed it. We rode north for the better part of a day. She didn't talk much. I didn't either. At midday I stopped at a creek and we drank, and I gave her dried meat and she ate it without making a face about it, which I noted. The country up there was high plains going toward the breaks, the grass just coming green in early April, the sky that particular blue that has no bottom to it. I watched her look at it. She'd been in the river town a long time. You could see her breathe differently out here, like something unwinding. Once in the afternoon she said, the people, will they? I said, some will be suspicious. That's normal. You'll have to earn your place the way anyone does. She said, by working. I said, by working and by being yourself. People can generally tell the difference. She was quiet again. A little later she said, my husband didn't like it out here. He said it was too empty. I said, it's not empty. She looked around. She said, no, I suppose it isn't. My sister Wackenny-edge-a-waist, that is good child in your language, though she is 43 and has a will like a post oak, met us at the entrance to the camp. She looked at Clara with the expression she uses when she is deciding something. Clara looked back at her with the same expression. They stood like that for a moment, and then my sister said something in Lakota. I translated. She says you look like you can work. Clara said, tell her I can. My sister heard the tone of it, if not the words, and something shifted in her face. Not a smile, but close. She said something else. She says she'll show you where things are. Clara said, tell her thank you. My sister took her by the arm, not roughly, and steered her toward the lodge. I watched them go. Wackenny-edge-a-waist leaned in close and said something to her, and Clara said something back in English, and my sister laughed. That short bark she has, surprised out of her. I don't know what was said. I never asked. It was theirs. I should say something about the band and how they received her, because it was not simple, and anything simple, I tell you, would be a lie. Some people were against it from the start and said so, to my face, which is the right way to be against something. An elder named Mato Sapa, Black Bear in your language, a man of 68 who had outlived 3 horses and 2 agents, and one particularly bad winter that had killed half his family, came to me the second day, and he said what he had to say plainly. He said that a white woman in the camp was a white woman's trouble visiting the camp. He said that white women came with white men behind them, and white men came with their grievances and their papers and their requirements. He said that I had bought one problem and would get many others as part of the bargain. I listened to all of it. Mato Sapa was right about everything he said. I said so. I said he was right, and that I had thought about all of it, and that I had decided anyway, and that if he wanted to argue further I would hear it. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "You haven't been the same since Tanyedu died." Not as an accusation, as an observation, and a sad one. I said, "No, I haven't." He grunted and walked away, and that was the argument. There were others, less direct, a look here, a distance there, the subtle adjustments of a community deciding where to put something new. The younger men mostly kept their opinions private, which meant they were watching. The women were more various. Some warm from the start, curious about her, pleased by the way she worked without being asked to prove herself. Some cool, one or two close to my sister, who seemed to be running a private trial of their own design and had not yet rendered a verdict. Clara felt all of this and said nothing about it to me, which was the right thing. She understood that it was not her problem to solve. She kept working, kept learning, kept being herself, and she let the band make up its own mind. By the fourth week, Mato Sapa's wife, a round, shrewd woman named Winona, who was the best hide worker in the camp, had taken to sitting near Clara while they worked. Not talking much, just near. Winona does not sit near people she doesn't want to sit near. I noticed this and kept the noticing to myself. There are things about that first month I won't put in order because they didn't happen in order. They happened the way things happen, sideways, in pieces, over fires and work, and the small negotiations of living close to another person. She learned to make wasna from my sister. She was bad at it for 2 weeks, and then she was good at it. She had a gift for tanning that neither she nor anyone else had known about, patient work, methodical, and my sister told me this with a kind of begrudging respect. The way you'd tell someone their dog was smarter than you'd expected. She learned some Lakota words. Not fast, but steady, and she didn't pretend to know them before she did, which is important. A person who pretends to know things is a liability. She asked questions directly, without embarrassment, and she remembered the answers. The children watched her the way children watch new things, circling, then creeping closer, then erupting into ordinary life around her. A girl named Sinksy Waist, she was maybe 6, attached herself to Clara's skirt for a week solid and had to be physically removed at intervals. Clara braided her hair. I saw this from across the camp, and I looked away and I looked back again without meaning to. One evening I came back from a council meeting. This was maybe 3 weeks in, and she was sitting outside the lodge with her mending, and there was a lamp burning beside her and the light was on her face, and she was concentrating on a seam, and I stood for a moment without her knowing I was there. She had her tongue between her teeth the way my wife Tanyedu had when she was working. Tanyedu. That is Autumn Woman. She died on the 7th day of a fever that came from nowhere in November, 2 years gone. You don't stop carrying that. Clara looked up and saw me and she said, "Good meeting." I said, "Long." She said, "There's food inside." I went in and ate, and she came in and put her mending away, and we did not speak much, but it was the easy quiet of people who have begun to know each other's weight in a space. The trouble came in May. It comes, it always does. You don't have to look for it on the frontier, it finds its own way. There were 3 men. They'd been working a claim up near the breaks that had played out, and they came south looking for trade, and they were the kind of men who, when they have a little money and no work and too much time, find ways to make trouble that they call something else. They came into the edge of the camp, not invited, past the marker stones where any man of sense would understand he was not welcome, and they had seen Clara at the creek, or heard about her, or both. Their names were Dahlin, Pritchard, and one I never learned because I didn't need to. They didn't come armed, which they thought made their intentions seem peaceful and which instead made them clear in a different way. Men who leave their guns outside a Lakota camp have already decided on a particular kind of boldness. They asked to speak with the chief. They were brought to me. Dahlin was the talker. He said they'd heard there was a white woman here. He said they didn't mean anything by it, just that it seemed unusual. He said he wondered if she was here of her own free will. He said this with a face arranged to look concerned, which is a face I had seen before and which always means something else. I looked at him. I said, "You want to see her?" He said he just wanted to make sure she was all right. I said, "She can tell you herself if you like." He said that would put his mind at ease. I had someone bring Clara. She came out and stood beside me, and she looked at these three men, and I watched her look at them. She knew men like this. You could see it in the way she held her arms, slightly crossed in front of her, not defensive exactly, more like a woman bracing for a smell. Dahlin said, "Ma'am, are you here willingly?" She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Yes." He said, "Ain't you a widow?" "From down at the river." She said, "That's right." He said, "These people treating you well?" She said, "Better than the last place I lived." He looked at me, then back at her. He said, "We just want to make sure you got options." She said, "I know what I have. Thank you for your concern." The last part of that sentence was such a particular shade of cold that Pritchard actually looked away. Dahlin tried once more, said something about how she could come with them if she had a mind to, that they'd see her safe to town, and she said, "I'm home, you should go." And the way she said home, not loud, not pointed, just flat and clear and certain, I felt it in my chest, the way you feel a bell that's too close. They went. My men watched them out of the camp, all the way to the tree line. They didn't come back. After they left, she turned to me, and there was color in her face, not embarrassment, something else, something more like anger at herself for having had to do that at all. She said, "This will happen again." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to be clear that I handled it." I looked at her. I said, "I know you did." She said, "I mean that I don't need." She stopped. She started again. "I don't need to be managed." I said, "Clara, I know that." She looked at me, and something in her unwound a little, not softening exactly, but a kind of release. She nodded once and went back inside. We were married in late May, at a council fire, in the way of my people. She had asked to understand the ceremony before it happened, and I explained it, and she asked good questions about the parts she didn't follow, and when she understood it, she said yes, this was right. I was 51 years old on the day I married her. My first wife was 17 when we married, and I was 22, and that marriage was long and good and changed everything about who I am, and the grief of losing her is still in me the way old cold is in stone. To marry again at 51 is a strange thing. You do not do it the way you did it at 22. You know too much about loss. You know how things end. But you also know, if you are lucky and if you have paid attention, what a good woman is worth, what it costs her to choose freely, what courage lives in that choosing. My sister put sage in Clara's hair. That was her idea. I didn't ask her to. Clara stood still for it, and when it was done, she touched the sage with one finger lightly and looked at my sister, and my sister patted her once on the shoulder. That was everything. At the ceremony there was a moment, the blanket sharing, where I wrapped us both in one blanket, and she was close to me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her, and she tipped her head to look at me and said something very quietly. I said, "What?" She said, "I want you to know I'm not afraid." I looked at her. I said, "I know." She said, "I wanted to say it anyway." I held the blanket around us and I thought, here is a woman who says what she means when she means it, and asks for what she needs, and handles what comes to her, and chose this with her eyes open. Those are not small things. In 51 years I have met very few people of either sex who do all four. There are things about a marriage you learn slowly. They come out over weeks and months, not all at once. She was afraid of owls. Not terribly, just a little, the same way she was afraid of deep water, a fear she'd had since childhood, something about a creek when she was 6. She told me this on a night when an owl called outside and she stirred. I asked her and she said it, just like that, plain and factual. "I am afraid of owls," she said, a little because of something when I was small. There was no apology in it. It was a fact about herself, reported as such. I find that harder than most things people do. To say a true thing about yourself that makes you seem lesser. She did it without effort, the way she did most things. She had a temper, not a mean one, the kind that comes from high standards applied to herself first and to the world second. When something was done badly or carelessly, she would say so, and she would be right, and then she would move on. My sister found this refreshing after some initial friction. They became not friends exactly in the beginning, but something better, useful to each other, honest with each other, genuinely interested in each other's competence. By midsummer, they were finishing each other's thoughts. She called me Red Hawk for 3 months and then switched to Hoka without announcing the change. And I didn't say anything about it because there was nothing to say. She asked me about Tanieru. She waited until she had been with me long enough to ask. About 4 months in, and she asked plainly, "Tell me about her." So I did. I told her about Tanieru for a long time that night, and she listened to all of it, and when I was done she said, "She sounds like someone I'd have liked." I believed her, which is not the same as believing a polite thing. She told me about Ned. She said he was not a bad man, but that he had been disappointed by himself, and had found it easier to be disappointed by everything around him, and that she had spent 6 years trying to be encouraging, and had finally understood that encouraging is not the same as helping. She said she missed the idea of Ned more than she missed Ned, which she said wasn't a kind thing to say about a dead man, and I said it didn't seem unkind to me, it seemed honest. She said she appreciated that I didn't tell her she should feel differently. She learned more Lakota. By winter she was getting by, in the way of a person who is serious about a thing and puts in the time. Sinksy Waste refused to help her pronounce certain sounds and found this very funny. Clara took it in stride, which made it funnier. There was a night in September when I came back from 2 weeks north, council business. A dispute over hunting territory that needed settling before the cold came. And when I rode into camp, it was full dark and the fire was low, and she was asleep inside. I had been 2 weeks on the trail. I was tired in the particular way of a man past 50 who does not allow himself to say so. I sat outside for a while in the dark, just sitting, the way I do when I've been among people who need things from me and need to come back to myself. She came out after a little while. I don't know what woke her, she said later she heard the horse. She sat down beside me without asking, without saying anything, and she put her shoulder against mine and she sat there. Just that. We sat for maybe an hour. She didn't ask about the trip. She didn't offer anything. She just put herself beside me like she belonged there, which she did, and that was enough and more. After a while she said, "Are you hungry?" I said, "A little." She said, "I'll get something." She went in and came out with food and I ate, and she sat beside me while I ate, and still neither of us said much. And I thought, this is a thing I did not expect to have again. Not this. Not this particular piece of someone who knows when to be quiet, who puts herself beside you not to take from you but to offer. She took the bowl when I was done and she set it aside, and I put my arm around her and she leaned in, and the fire was almost coals and the stars were out, and I was an old man with a good woman beside him who had chosen to be there. And that is the whole of it, really. That is what I have to tell you. The winter came hard that year. They do, out here, the way things that are honest come hard, without apology, without preparation, just arriving in the night and staying. The first real snow was in October, and by November we'd had 3 storms and the creek had ice 6 inches thick, and the wood took all day to split for what we'd burn in 2. She did not complain about the cold. She grew quieter as the temperature dropped, more focused. The way some people get in hard weather, contracted into their core, efficient. She and my sister worked the lodge together like 2 people who have done it many years, moving around each other, handing things without asking. I watched this and thought of my own mother and her sisters, how a household with women who trust each other has a particular sound to it, lower, more even, like a machine that's found its rhythm. She learned to read the weather, which is something you can't be taught. You learn it or you don't. She'd come out in the morning and look at the sky and make a call going to blow by noon, she'd say, or clear until evening, and she was right more than she was wrong. She learned it the way she learned everything, by paying attention and not pretending she knew more than she did. I have said she was not afraid. I should be more precise. She was afraid of things. She was afraid of deep water, of owls, of the particular fear that comes from having been at the mercy of people who had no mercy. What I mean when I say she was not afraid is that she didn't let it govern her. She felt it and she moved through it. This is what courage is, in my understanding, not the absence of the feeling but the choice about what to do with it. She cried once in my presence that winter, once. We were in the lodge and she was reading a letter that had come down from a trapper heading north from her sister in Ohio, the first word she'd had from home in 8 months, and she read it, and then she put it down and she cried quietly, turned away from me, for maybe 2 minutes. Then she folded the letter and put it in the tin box and she was done. I said nothing because there was nothing to say. She said, "My sister has a new baby, a girl." I said, "What's her name?" She said, "Ruth." I said that was a good name. She agreed that it was, and that was all. I want to tell you about a particular night in December, because it was the night I understood something I hadn't understood before, or hadn't let myself understand. We'd had 3 days of storm, the kind that comes down from the north with no warning and no mercy, wind that packs the snow sideways so you can't see your hand in front of your face, temperature dropping to a place where your breath freezes before it clears your mouth. The band pulled in close, conserved wood, stayed inside. I went out 3 times over those 3 days to check on the outlying members, the old ones. A young mother with a new baby, Mato Sapa's lodge, which was the farthest out. Each time I went out, Clara handed me my heaviest robe without being asked and said, "How long?" And I told her, and I went. And when I came back, she had food and fire waiting, not by watching for me, but by knowing my pace by then, well enough to have it ready. The 3rd day, late, the storm broke. It breaks the way those storms break, not gradually, but all at once, like a hand lifted from a drum. The wind stops and the silence is so loud after 3 days of roaring that it almost hurts. I went outside. The sky came clear and the stars were extraordinary, the particular brilliance of a cold, clear night after a big storm, everything washed and still. She came out behind me. I didn't ask her to. She put on her robe and she came out and she stood beside me, looking up, and her breath came in small clouds and her cheeks were red from the fire warm she'd just left. She said, "Lord." Just that, Lord, looking at the stars. I looked at her face while she was looking up, and there was something in it I hadn't seen in exactly that way before, not wonder exactly, not happiness, something quieter, something underneath those. She looked like a person who had arrived somewhere, not a destination she'd planned for, but somewhere real, somewhere that was hers. She looked over and caught me looking, and she didn't look away. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing." She looked back at the stars. She said quietly, "Is it always like this after a storm?" I said, "Usually." She said, "Good." We stood there for a while in the cold, not touching, just side by side in the star-bright silence of the plains after 3 days of fury. And I thought I let myself think it, for the first time clearly, that I had not been wrong, that what I'd felt when I rode to that trading post, what I'd felt when I put those pelts on Harker's counter, had not been foolishness or loneliness or the weakness of an old man who'd lost his wife. It had been something accurate, a recognition of the kind that doesn't explain itself in words but doesn't need to. I had seen something in the shape of her situation, not her, I hadn't met her, I knew nothing except what Tall Feather had told me, and I had seen something that deserved a better outcome than it was heading for. That's the truest thing I can say about why I went. Not rescue, not acquisition, not sentiment. Something more like This trajectory is wrong and I have the means to change it, and that seems like a thing to do. What came after was hers. The choosing was hers, and it was real, and I had known enough choosing women in my life to know the difference between a woman who has settled and a woman who has decided, and she had decided. That night before we went in, she put her hand through my arm. Just that, her hand through my arm, the way you walk with someone, not dramatic, nothing announced. Just the gesture of a person who is where she wants to be, with who she wants to be. I put my hand over hers. We went inside. I want to say something about what it is to be a chief, because I think it explains things. You spend most of your time deciding. Small decisions, large ones, what to do about the hunt, how to settle a quarrel, how to talk to the agents when they come with their papers and their condescension dressed up as helpfulness. You are the one people come to, and you are supposed to be certain, or to seem certain, because the people need the ground under their feet to be solid, and you are part of the ground. You learn to be alone inside this, not lonely. Alone the way a post is alone, doing its job by staying fixed. Tanietu had known this. She had known how to reach around it when I needed her to. She was quick and bright, and she teased me out of myself when I'd been too long in the solitary place that this work makes. Clara found a different way. She didn't try to reach around it. She came and sat beside it. She was content with my silences in a way that was not resignation. She could talk. She liked to talk. She asked more questions than most men I've known. But she understood the difference between a man who needs quiet and a man who is closed, and she never confused the two. When I came home heavy, she felt it without my saying so, and she made the lodge easy. When I came home clear, she wanted to know everything, and I told her, and she listened the way my mother used to listen, turning her head slightly as if to hear better, her hands still. That is not a small gift. A woman who listens like that, without needing to fix it or match it or be acknowledged for her own contribution while you're still talking, that is something a man finds rarely. That second winter she started teaching. It began with the children. She had no formal plan for it. It grew out of the same instinct she brought to everything, the instinct of a woman who sees something useful to be done and does it. Sinksy Waste had attached herself so completely that Clara began teaching her English, and then 2 other children came to watch, and then their older siblings, and by midwinter she was holding what amounted to a school 3 mornings a week, in the lodge, with 6 children sitting in a row and Clara drawing letters in ash on a flat piece of bark. Mato Sapa came and looked at it one morning. He stood in the entrance and watched for a while without saying anything, and then he went away. 3 days later his granddaughter was in the row. He never said anything to me about it, and I never said anything to him. You let people come to their conclusions in their own time. She taught both directions, English to the children, some Lakota back from them. By spring the children who came to her had a serviceable start in English writing, and Clara had improved her Lakota considerably from having to respond to 6 children's questions simultaneously, which is a brutal and effective education in any language. She told me once, on a night in February, that she had wanted to be a teacher when she was young. Before Ned, before the frontier, before all the narrowing that a woman's life does in a certain kind of circumstances. She had the ability for it, she said. She'd always been good at holding several people's attention at once, at explaining things clearly. But a preacher's daughter from Ohio in 1849 did not become a teacher unless she found a frontier school willing to hire her, and the frontier school that had been willing to hire her had also come with Ned Marsh, so she had married him and left the school behind. She said this without bitterness. That was the remarkable thing about her. She carried her history without being weighed down by it. She could tell you hard things in a plain voice, not because she didn't feel them, but because she had already done whatever feeling was necessary and had moved on. I found this characteristic of hers both admirable and occasionally frustrating, in the way of a thing that is better than you at its own version of something. I said, "You're teaching now." She looked at me, and then she looked at the bark tablet propped against the lodge wall, and she said, "I suppose I am." In the spring, the second spring, there was a meeting with the Indian agent, a man named Cutler who wore a coat too heavy for the weather and had a smile that arrived before his words and left before his words did. He came to talk about land. They always came to talk about land. Clara was not supposed to be at the meeting. The agent had not expected her and did not know what to do with her. He looked at her and he looked at me and he said with his fixed smile, "And this is?" I said, "My wife." He said, "Ah," with a certain flatness. Clara looked at him and said, "Good afternoon." He said good afternoon with his smile doing its arriving and departing business, and then he made the mistake of saying, in a tone he'd softened just enough to think I wouldn't notice, something about how he imagined it must be strange for her, out here. She said, "Strange." He said he only meant that it was, and here he gestured vaguely at the camp around us. The lodges, the children, my sister stringing meat on the drying rack 40 yards off. She said, "I live here." He said, "Yes, of course." She said, "This is my home. My husband is chief of this band. I don't find it strange at all." She said it the way she said most things, level, direct, no performance in it. Then she said, "Shall we get to the business?" He looked at me. I had nothing on my face for him to read because I had put nothing there. He looked back at her and then he opened his papers and we got to the business. After he left, she and I stood outside watching his wagon go south in its cloud of trail dust. She had her arms crossed against the spring cool, and after a moment she said, "He expected me to be embarrassed." I said, "Yes." She said, "He'd been looking forward to that." I said, "Yes." She said, "Well," and left it at that. I looked at her, the set of her shoulders, the way she was watching that wagon get small in the distance, and I thought, this woman has been underestimated by nearly every man she has ever met, and every one of them has been wrong. My sons came that summer. 2 of them, Tasunk and the younger one, Kanghai, which means raven. They came to see what I'd done, which is the right thing for sons to do. Tasunk was 30, broad-shouldered, serious. Kanghai was 26 and quick, with his mother's eyes. They came riding in one morning and we ate and talked about the band's business, and I could feel them watching Clara without watching her, sideways attention, the kind you learn to read. She didn't perform for them. That's the best way I have to say it. She didn't try to make them like her, and she didn't try to seem appropriate, and she didn't defer more than courtesy required. She was herself, asking Kanghai about his trading route when she heard him mention it, making a small dry joke when Tasunk said something that deserved one, getting up to bring food when the fire needed tending without making it a demonstration of her domesticity. Tasunk was harder. He asked her once, he thought I was outside, he said, "Did you come here because you had nowhere else to go?" She said, "I came here because Red Hawk offered something honest, and I hadn't had that in a while." He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I'm here because I want to be." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "My mother was a good woman." She said, "I know. He told me." Another pause, then Tasunk said, "He talked to you about her?" She said, "At length." There was something in the air after that. I could feel it when I came back in, something that had shifted between them, not all the way to ease but away from suspicion. Tasunk ate the second bowl of food she offered without hesitating, which from him is a form of statement. Kanghai liked her immediately, which was easier and also somewhat less meaningful, since Kanghai likes most things. When they left, Tasunk touched my arm and said, quietly in Lakota, "She speaks well of herself without speaking well of herself," which is how you say, in my language, that a person has dignity. I said, "Yes. She does." He rode south and I watched him go, and I thought of his mother, and I thought of Clara, and I thought about the particular luck of a man who has known, in one life, 2 good women. There is a thing that happens in the third year of a marriage, or near there, that does not happen in the first year or the second. The first year you are still learning the shape of each other. The second year you know the shape, but you are still adjusting your own to account for it. The third year the shapes have found each other, the way two rivers find their joining, and after that the current is different, slower in some ways, deeper in others. You stop performing for each other, even the small performances that you do without knowing you're doing them. You are just there, and the other person is just there. And what is between you is real in the way that daily bread is real, not remarkable, essential. I did not know I had missed this. I did not know I had missed it because I had told myself that what Taniedu and I had was singular. And it was entirely itself. I will not say otherwise, and that the particular daily bread of it was gone with her and not a thing that came again. I had been wrong about that, not about the singularity, about the possibility. Clara is not Taniedu. She is entirely Clara, different in her bones, her voice, her way of being angry and her way of being easy, her history, her hands, the way she wakes up fast where Taniedu woke slowly, the way she keeps accounts in her head of things owed and paid that Taniedu had no interest in, the way she argues, which is like cutting, precise and clean, no wasted motion. She is her own woman made by her own life, and she came to me complete, not as something to be shaped. What is the same, what I had not expected to find again, is the particular ease. The ease of a person who knows you well enough that you can be tired in their presence without it meaning anything. The ease of a man who can sit at his own fire and not have to hold himself a certain way. I had not known how much of my life since Taniedu I had spent holding myself a certain way. You do not know attention until it is released. I am telling you all this from a distance of some years. There is snow on the ground outside the lodge, and it is early and she is still sleeping, and I have come out to start the fire, and I am sitting here in the cold in the particular stillness that the plains have before the light comes all the way up. I want to tell you one more thing about Kanghai before I finish. He came back the following spring, alone this time, just passing through on a trading run north. He sat with Clara for a long time while I was out. I came back and found them by the fire, talking, and Kanghai was gesturing with his hands the way he does when he's explaining something he finds funny, and she was laughing. I had heard her laugh before. She had a real one, not a polite one, low and abrupt, surprised out of her, and she was doing that, and Kanghai was pleased with himself the way young men are when they've made a woman they respect laugh that way. He looked up when I came in and he said in Lakota, still grinning, "She knows things." I said, "Yes." He said, "She told me about Ohio, about the river towns, about her family." I looked at Clara, she looked at me, she said, "He asked." I said, "Good." Kanghai said more quietly, "She told me about the debt. What it actually was, what those men were doing." I didn't say anything. He looked at me and then down at the fire and then back at me, and in his face was something I recognized from his mother, that particular form of understanding that arrives late and lands hard. He said, "You went there to stop something." I said, "I went there to give her a way out if she wanted one." He thought about this. He said, "That's different than I thought." I said, "Most things are." He stayed 3 days and left on a clear morning, and before he rode out he embraced Clara, which Kanghai doesn't do easily, which told me everything. I paid 14 beaver pelts for a woman's debt, 11 prime winter, 3 good fall. I have never thought of it as buying her. A man does not buy a person. What I bought was a receipt, a piece of paper, and what I did with that paper was remove a claim that men with no right to it had made on her freedom. That's all. The rest was hers to decide. She decided. She has been deciding every morning for 3 years, in the way of a person who could also decide otherwise and knows it, and that is what the choosing means. A kept woman stays because she has no other place. A wife stays because she has made a life. Clara has made a life. With her hands, her attention, her patience and her temper and her tongue, She has made a life here that is hers, and she is in it, and I am in it beside her, and this is the only kind of love worth having, the kind that a strong person who has other options chose. I did not know when I put those 11 pelts on Harker's counter what I was buying. I knew what I was paying. What I was buying turned out to be this: the possibility. The door left open. What walked through it she carried herself, and it was more than I knew to ask for. The sky is going gray now. Pink in the east, gray overhead, the dark not gone but thinned. The fire is catching and the light is on the lodge, and in a little while she'll come out with her hair loose. She does that first thing before she pins it, and I don't know if she knows I've noticed, but I have, every morning for 3 years, the way she comes into the light with her hair loose. And she'll look at the sky the way she does, to take its measure, and she'll say something about the weather, and we'll go inside and there'll be food and work and all the particular business of the day. I am 54 years old. I have been a chief, a husband, a son, a soldier, a hunter, a man who sat across from liars and kept his face still. I have had more taken from me than I will count here. I have had grief enough for 2 lives. And I have this: the fire and the light coming, and her footstep on the frozen ground, and 54 years enough behind me that I know exactly what this is. It's everything.